It's been 8 years since the United Nations introduced the doctrine called the Responsibility to Protect, or R2P. 8 years since first world nations promised to guard against genocide, atrocity, and war crimes around the world. Joining us now from New York, New York, to give us an update on the efficacy of the R2P doctrine, Naomi Kikoler. She is Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. And Naomi, it's good of you to join us on the line from New York. How are you tonight?
Very good. Thank you so much, Steve, for having me.
I guess we should point out you're one of us, right? You're from up here.
I am. Very proud Canadian, so thank you for this honor.
Excellent. We're happy to have you on the line. I want to start talking about a very unhappy place in the world right now, which of course is Syria, where according to the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, nearly 70,000 people have died since the uprising against the Assad regime began in 2011. I guess for some people this would seem to be a pretty clear-cut case of where R2P ought to be put into effect in order to prevent atrocities against civilians, and yet it hasn't happened. How come, in your view?
Well, we definitely share the agreement that the responsibility to protect is very relevant to the situation in Syria. You know, the latest accounts of over 70,000 people have been killed. We're rapidly approaching the second anniversary of the start of the conflict there. In our opinion, the responsibility to protect has been employed in Syria. We have seen a lot of member states take considerable initiatives to try to protect populations in Syria and try to ensure that the situation doesn't deteriorate any further. Now, those measures may not have resulted in lives lost, unfortunately, today in Syria, but we do think that we've seen considerable kind of forward momentum in terms of the responsibility to protect building status as a norm. And we do think that we have to look at the responsibility to protect as a kind of long-term agenda. I think the situation in Syria right now, though, points to not a failure of the responsibility to protect, but rather a failure of the international community to really show unity, and in particular for the P5 members of the Security Council, notably Russia and China, to work with their international partners to uphold the responsibility to protect.
No, that's fair enough, that last point that you made, but my hunch is that, fair-minded people looking at this would say, really? You think R2P has been put into effect here? There are no boots on the ground from any other countries around the world. It feels as if really the most tough sanctions that could be applied have not been applied yet. The best potential arming of the rebels against the regime hasn't taken place yet. So you really want to stand by that you think R2P has been put into effect here?
You know, we take the perspective that this really is a long-term agenda, as I mentioned, and we've been working on the responsibility to protect since 2005 when the norm was first agreed to, and we think we've made considerable strides. I think the fact that you've seen countries from around the world, including, for example, Canada, do pretty much everything that they can to try to protect populations in Syria says a lot. We've seen targeted sanctions enacted, as you mentioned, at the bilateral level. We've seen the EU and other regional organizations enact them. We've seen country after country shut down their embassies. We've seen considerable amount of humanitarian assistance sent to Syria. Again, that means little to the person in Aleppo today who's facing, kind of mortar fire on a regular basis. But I do think that if we compare the international response today to what was done, for example, in 1994 around Rwanda or around Srebrenica, we do see a change in the way the international community regards what its responsibilities should be in this particular case. Unfortunately, not every member state feels the same way. And I think Russia today is a perfect example of a country that has yet to fully embrace the responsibility to protect. And I think until they do, we're going to continue to see serious challenges when it comes to actually being able to halt mass atrocities once they've started. A lot of what the responsibility to protect entails is actually requiring states to take preventive measures prior to the outbreak of mass atrocity crimes. And I think that preventive element is the area where we're beginning to see greater movement from member states and a real effort to try to strengthen the kind of institutional architectures for prevention that exist at the domestic and international level. Again, that means nothing for the people in Aleppo today, but I do think we see a real concerted effort to try to make R2P more real, both in terms of preventive stage, but also looking for all possible strategies to try to, in the absence of Russia's support for, as you said, a more coercive response, be it tougher sanctions, ICC referral, or boots on the ground, it at this stage is pretty much, I think the best that we can hope for.
Well, okay, I'm going to come back at you on this one more time, because again, if we're going to talk about that person in Aleppo who's facing shell fire every day of his or her life, the quote that you just said, we're doing everything we can under responsibility to protect, given the political realities of the world, the Russians being against and so on, that just, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like that's true. It doesn't feel like we're trying to impose a no-fly zone. It doesn't feel like we're not sending maybe some NATO flyers overhead and dropping some bombs on the Assad regime, as opposed to having that regime do that to its own people. So when you talk about we're doing everything we can under R2P, it just feels hollow, I must say. So again, are you sure you want to stand by that?
I mean, Steve, I think that, yes, there are, as you said, you could go in through a coalition of the willing to do, for example, the enforcement of a no-fly zone. But I think we have to look at what the consequences of that particular action are. First of all, would a no-fly zone actually help address the types of threats that civilians on the ground face right now in Aleppo, in terms of who's killing them and how are they killing them? Are they being killed because there are jets overhead that are bombing them, or is the greatest threat to their life coming from snipers? Now, if it's snipers, then a no-fly zone will not help. If you enforce a no-fly zone in Syria right now without the approval of the Security Council, and without the approval of Russia and China, the long-term consequences of that are going to be quite severe. I think that, unfortunately, when we talk about the responsibility to protect, and again, the reason that I keep going back to prevention is because I think that prevention is where we can have the greatest gains. We have to recognize that the responsibility to protect will always, unfortunately, face certain challenges coming from certain things like national interests, but also that there will at times be, unfortunately, a lack of unity. And again, I don't think that's a failure of the responsibility to protect. I think that's a failure of the international community to really act as one to respond to these types of crisis situations. And I think that all pressure needs to be put on Russia and on China and on other actors that could be doing more in this particular case to come on side.
Okay, but the layperson looking at this might conclude the following. They might say, when a brutal dictator decided that he looked like he was about to rise up and kill his people in Libya, the American administration, in particular the female leadership in the administration, Susan Rice, Hillary Clinton, went to the president and said, you can't allow this. We have a responsibility to protect. And much of the world rose up and got rid of Gaddafi, and we know what the result has been. We have not seen a similar, well, we've seen a similar rhetorical outcry against what's going on in Syria, but none of the follow-up, none of the military follow-up, none of the diplomatic follow-up, or not enough of the diplomatic follow-up. So I wonder whether or not, again, for that person in Aleppo having bombs dropped on his or her head every day, whether they're looking at this doctrine and thinking, well, you were prepared to do it for the folks over in Libya, but not for us. Why not?
Look, I think you're making a very, very fair point, and I think the argument of consistency and the need for consistency is something that we as advocates and supporters of Responsibility to Protect care immensely about. I mean, for myself, growing up, the whole narrative in Never Again was very personal. My paternal grandparents came to Canada as refugees from the Holocaust. And when I looked and I worked in Rwanda, I kept asking myself, what does never again mean? Is this never again for my family, or is this never again for everyone? And I think I can, sympathize immensely with the person in Aleppo who's thinking, if only I was in Benghazi. But I can tell you from meetings with Security Council members very early on, within the first month of the uprising in Syria, unfortunately, the manner in which Security Council members were addressing the situation in Syria and looking at the situation in Libya were dramatically different. The calculus, the interests they were taking into account were very different. And it's, incumbent on advocates like ourselves and other human rights advocates to constantly try to urge council members to treat each situation in a consistent manner. But it is, to be very honest, an uphill battle, because unfortunately at times it appears as though life means something different in different states for different political actors when it should not. And we've seen that time and again, be it in Kyrgyzstan, in Darfur, in Rwanda. And I would argue that because we see these inconsistencies doesn't mean we should abandon the responsibility to protect. I think it means that we have to redouble our efforts and try to come up with new strategies to engage council members that are recalcitrant, but also look for ways to, as I mentioned before, really strengthen preventive efforts so that we can avert these situations from happening in the first place. It may never be perfect, but I think we can come a long way and go a long way to try to address some of the underlying factors that tend to lead to these types of situations.
Okay, let's take a step back from the immediate danger in Syria and just talk more generically about what this doctrine is supposed to mean. Obviously, there is an operating principle around the world that states don't infringe on the sovereignty of other states unless, you know, you absolutely positively have to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder to what extent you believe that R2P infringes upon state sovereignty or a doctrine of non-intervention that most countries of the world have been operating under for a very long time.
It's a great question and a controversial question. I mean, our position is that we have seen an evolution in how state sovereignty is regarded by states. And we've seen that in part because since the Second World War, the international community has signed on to a number of human rights treaties and declarations that has kind of transformed the way sovereignty is seen. And as a result, we do believe that if a government is willing to commit mass atrocity crimes or will stand by as non-state parties commit mass atrocity crimes, they themselves are not fulfilling their own responsibilities and are not acting in accordance with the values that one would expect of a sovereign state. So we don't see it as infringing on state sovereignty. And I think that's one of the key kind of developments that has happened not only from 2005 when the international community agreed to the World Summit Outcome document where R2P was kind of committed to, but it's something that has been taking place for the last 20, 30 years. And this is part of that kind of general progression.
Does R2P allow for regime change?
It's a big question, especially in light of what happened in Libya. And we would argue that, you know, the responsibility to protect is not about regime change, nor is it, for example, about democracy promotion. In the case of regime change, there are certain instances where it would be hard to imagine a particular leader remaining in power. So, for example, I'll go back to the case of Rwanda. It would be hard to imagine that the Habyarimana regime today would be governing Rwanda. That was a clear case where, unfortunately, or fortunately, to stop the mass atrocities that were happening, to stop the genocide, required a regime change. And one can make the argument that in certain cases elsewhere that might be needed as well. I think what we urge states to do, once we're talking about the coercive use of force, we encourage states to make the argument clearly as to why, for example, in the case of Gaddafi, it was necessary for Gaddafi to be removed. And to make it very clear that if he is being removed, it's because he himself poses a threat to civilians, and unless he was removed, civilians would continue to bear the brunt of mass atrocities perpetrated by his government, or in other cases, their governments.
Well, you see where I'm going here, of course, because again, we have comparisons to Syria, but in the case of Gaddafi, there were countries, significant countries in the world, the BRIC countries, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa too, I think, that opposed that intervention in Libya and thought that NATO had no business going in there toppling a sovereign government. And I wonder whether you think the responsibility to protect in that case was in effect violated because a sovereign government was overturned.
I'd like to just kind of qualify your question just a little bit. I think it's really important for your viewers to know that the decision for NATO to go into Libya to protect populations, in keeping with the responsibility to protect, was something that had widespread agreement. The Security Council would never have been able to authorize NATO to move forward with that intervention had Russia and China and the BRICS members, so, you know, we had, the IBSA members, India, Brazil, and South Africa, who were all on the Security Council at the time, had they not tacitly allowed or voted for, as South Africa did, we would never have seen that intervention. Where their objections began to emerge were on questions like what you've raised. The kind of announcement within about 3 days of the authorization of Resolution 1973, there was an announcement by kind of the UK, France, and the US that they were going to essentially get rid of Gaddafi. And I think that, you know, one of the things that happened, and it's really important to recognize that today to respond to mass atrocity crimes around the world, there's no single government that can do it alone. We need a multilateral response. As soon as you require a multilateral response, you have to be very careful about your messaging to your partners and keeping your partners engaged and abreast of what you're trying to do. And I think there was a real sense, especially from the IBSA countries, that NATO and the US and the UK and France needed their support for about 24 hours to pass the Security Council resolution. And after that, everything was fair game. And I think they felt as though NATO did not sufficiently report to the Security Council, that there were certain council members that were violating certain kind of arms embargoes, notably France, and that with the decision to go after Gaddafi personally, they did overstep that particular mandate. And I think it's a tough question. I would have urged the Peace 3, which we did at the time, to make explicit what their rationale was for targeting Gaddafi specifically and how it fit in the broader mandate to protect civilians. Some, including the South Africans, argue that perhaps there would have been the possibility of a negotiated outcome. And I need to stress that from the Responsibly Protect perspective, what we care about is stopping the threat of mass atrocities. And we recognize that in certain cases, stopping the threat of mass atrocities requires that perhaps governments, rulers, presidents, prime ministers may need to stay in power, or perhaps there'll be a transitional government. We look at all possible options and consider which options is most viable to achieving the end goal, which is protecting populations.
Okay, understood. But you'll have heard this criticism before, and let me get you to respond to it, which is that it's all well and good for R2P to be invoked by a bunch of big, powerful countries against little countries. But nobody can imagine R2P being invoked by a bunch of big countries against, say, China for its treatment of the Uyghur people or its treatment of people in Tibet. Fair criticism, eh?
I think it is a fair criticism, and I think it's a real challenge. I think it goes back to the consistency question that you raised before. There are populations that are at risk of mass atrocities in many parts of the world. Now, again, I think it's a question of threshold in terms of which situations we think are relevant. But I think the idea that the Responsibly Protect would be invoked against a P5 member, irrespective of who they are, is a real question that I today don't think we would see happen. But again, I don't think that that should mean we throw R2P out. I would like to just say that, we focus, as I've mentioned, on prevention. Right now, you have 25 countries that have appointed senior-level government officials who are focal points of the Responsibility to Protect. And this is not just countries like the United States. It's countries like Ghana, countries like Guatemala. And they're responsible for coming up with domestic strategies to ensure that both populations at home, in their region and abroad, are protected from mass atrocity crimes. Again, 10 years ago, we would never have seen that in place. This is a long-term agenda. We're trying to move forward a norm that is very controversial. I think the Libya case was actually very useful for R2P because it exposed some of the challenges that come when you try to implement something as difficult as this. We have yet to fully understand how these crimes happen, which makes it very difficult for us to understand where are the interruption points, who has leverage in these particular situations, what type of measures work or don't work to protect populations. Part of this is learning as we go, and I think that what the lesson of Libya was is that it's very difficult to do this. It didn't take 2 weeks, it took months, and we required a multilateral response. It could not just be the US and France and the UK. And I think that, it's really important just to recognize that advancing the Responsibility to Protect is not easy, and it won't happen with the blink of the eye. But I think we have made very significant advances in trying to, if not prevent mass atrocities from happening anywhere in the world, to at least mitigate the impact that they might have in certain parts of the world. And I will say again, from a personal perspective, I would much rather we do something to ensure that people who have experienced things along the lines of what my grandparents did are at least having some sort of help and at least require some sort of attention from the international community than to truly just abandon everyone and not try to move R2P forward. No,
fair enough, Naomi, and that's why in our last 30 seconds here, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us one example in the world where you feel the implementation of R2P worked and saved lives, and we can tell the world about it now.
Well, I think Kenya in 2007 and 2008 is one example. It's definitely in the news again because their elections are going to happen on March 4th, and we're very concerned that there might be a repeat of violence, which again raises some questions about, the Responsibility to Protect needs to be a long-term effort that's being pursued by domestic and international actors. But in Kenya, we saw a situation where Kofi Annan led an African Union mediation team and managed to quell violence that within 2 months had already claimed 1,300 lives and resulted in the displacement of 600,000 people. Security Council only issued one presidential statement, very light touch from the Security Council in terms of its engagement, but what we saw was a real concerted effort by local, regional, and international actors to work together to try to prevent crimes from continuing and to save lives, and it worked. And I think that there are cases like that out there where you see measures being employed that fall far short of the use of force. And I think those are the types of cases that we should try to replicate.
Understood. Naomi Kikoler, it's good of you to join us on the line from New York tonight. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.